upon you. Welcome to Sunrise in Pineland. We're the people who are the freedom fighters here in America, standing against tyranny at all times and working to get out of this insane system. So, today's a special show. I'm going to do a geopolitical primer for you all, which is to say that a lot of people have come to me over the years and they've asked for sort of a comprehensive history of how we find ourselves at the brink of World War III. Today, I'm going to give you the short and dirty Cliff Notes version of what happened. Each of these topics is very complex. We're going to talk about China, we're going to talk about Russia, we're going to talk about Iran, and we're going to talk about NATO, and we're going to talk as well about powers that are important at the periphery. It's a little warmer than usual today. It's not freezing in here, so I can take the hat off. We're going to talk about Japan a little bit. We're going to talk about India a little bit. We're going to talk about the Middle East a little bit. And I'm going to bounce around a little bit, and then at the end of it, we're going to talk at the end of the instability that's happening in Western nations, between the market losing money constantly, the instability of crypto, the inflation that is breaking the dollar, the existence of alternatives that are being created for SWIFT. You see a Chinese-Russian banking situation being set up, as well as the supply shortages, because a lot of our goods do come from China, and the ongoing logistical shortages from the various things of backup, whether it's the convoy going up to Ottawa and all the Americans who are joining them. Interestingly, there's your January 6th moment of what could actually represent change, and it's not meant in a violent way, just like it wasn't meant in a violent way last time. It just people are going up there, but you need to know the background to this, and you need to understand there's at the core of this, there's an equation. If the elites in America and in the West generally feel like they're losing control, they've lost the narrative over the injections, they've lost the idea that people can even stand for them, and they can't build any more walls, the ones they say aren't effective on the southern border around the White House, they may launch us into war through various false flag means. And what that would do is they do that to get away from the domestic situation they can't handle. So the American domestic situation and World War III are inextricably interlinked at this point, because the world reserve currency is the reason why the West continues to play into this war. At least on the surface, there's a deeper level, of course, with the bankers and their globalist efforts, like the World Economic Forum is exemplary of, that they want a single global unit. And who knows, maybe they want to divide it into 10 regions. I'm a biblical guy. I think that's a very real possibility. But we'll go into that as we go forward. Try to focus the show and do not monologue. If you like this sort of content, we try to do deep dives in the show. We connect pieces other people can't. Big, deep, general base of knowledge, and we're going to be bringing more people onto the program in the future to help have interesting conversations and bring background on what's happening here, as well as the question which this show purports to solve, which is how sane people stuck in the West get away from the governments that are leading us unto death. And whether you look at that from the moral perspective, from the sort of policies they create, they're so damaging to culture and people's ability to interact with each other, or to the geopolitical aspects, where literally they're risking nuclear war over a country that in Ukraine that isn't worth this effort. Nonetheless, all that has to be covered. If you like it, please support the program, the Venmo, CVC, PRV. You get content here you won't get anywhere else. P.O. Box 35, Greenville Junction, Maine, 04442. If you want to interact more with our community, learn what we're about, go on Telegram, t.me/Atlantic Homeland. All Pinelanders are welcome. And just so you understand real fast what Pinelanders are about, Pineland, the idea of Pineland is it's the people who are pulling out of this. So we are people who did not, by and large, take the injection. Overwhelmingly, we have Christians who are concerned about how we actually build a better society and morality, and that we are trying to get away from this. We want separation from the insanity, whether it's the woke theology, the secular theologies of the state, or whether it's the militarism coming out of Washington. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. But to understand all that, we got to go back in time. So we're going to go, and, history, my background, just a formal background. I have an honors degree in history from Swarthmore College, a bachelor, very good school, and I've spent years, I'm the author now of, I think, 13 books, if I remember right, including 3 or 4 on history, so this is what I specialize on. My background's actually in European and medieval history, so we can take a look at this, and I've done a lot on war studies at this point, because I spent all my time marinating in think tanks and things like the RAND Corporation. So it sort of will give you a broad outlook of it, and talk about how America got involved at the beginning and the problems of all of the countries that we're really worried about today, which are going to be Russia, China, and Iran. And we're going to try to pick that story up after the Cold War, just give you a very light briefing on that. And what you have to understand is that NGOs are nothing new. It just had been in the old days, they were just called bankers and oligarchs. And whether they were the oligarchs on Wall Street to help fund the original Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which was not overwhelmingly of Russian ethnic stock, that this displaced and murdered the czarist policies under Nicholas. The Bolsheviks were people who had a certain frankly, they had a Zionist-friendly outlook, and I know that's a word that's hard for people, but this is the way it was. They came in there with the communist ideals, and they imposed it on the Russian people. First, they took over the cities, much like we see happened here in the U.S. And I think one of the things that's interesting that people have to consider as they look at this is just remember how you felt about how when you saw the riots in places like Portland or Seattle or Ferguson or Baltimore, wherever they're, and that the government doesn't enforce laws. And this is something we have ongoing now. I was listening last night. They were talking about in Philadelphia, and in Philadelphia now they have a DA who won't prosecute anything. And why don't they want to prosecute anything? Because when people are mad, they demand solutions. And what's the solution? Power to the state, a federal police force. And you see the outlines of this coming forward. I think in the fact that the U.S. Capitol Police is now beginning to try to say we're going to take jurisdiction on behalf of the government beyond the boundaries of the District of Columbia, which they don't really have the authority to do. But the Capitol comes forward just like we're living in the Hunger Games. So be careful if you're in the districts. Watch for that. What we have seen, though, is that sort of violence that's been provoked on one side is an effort to create a paramilitary force here in America for a civil war that the government intended to pick against the people. And so you understand if you were going to radicalize and actualize, people like Antifa, who were traditionally not the gun people, who weren't willing to fight, you had to have the government step out of the way. And because the people in charge of the government, who ruled people like the FBI, wanted to see paramilitaries form on a left-wing basis, what they did was they looked the other way while drug trafficking allowed the guns to run in and gave them plausible deniability. Like, look the other way with the Confucius Institutes, radicalized into textbook Maoism. And now we have these forces here within the United States, as well as in other countries, and that the youth has been radicalized. This has been a long, ongoing thing, and I go back. Good morning to see you. Good. Hope the Beagle's doing well, but out there and give my best to the missus. So when we did that same strategy was the strategy that was used in the Bolshevik Revolution that was funded by the U.S. And if the U.S. hadn't entered the war would have ended in 1917. The Kaiser would have survived. America wouldn't have been in a war. You wouldn't have had the bonus army. The Tsar would have been together, but that all went differently. And so we went on the Bolshevik road, which America funded very heavily, including in the Second World War, which is the reason why, in fact, the side won and how we enabled global communism and the many deaths it caused. Whether you think that's better or worse than the Germans, that's a political debate. You could have another place. Not important here. But the bottom line is Russia's imposition of the Soviet Union was caused by American banking. Understand that. You can go back, look at the Astor family, look at the history of it, not the purpose of it, just giving you the deep dive to get you started. China, in a similar sort of vein, had the same problem. After World War I, you'll remember, or maybe you won't, that Japan was allied to the United States, and Japan, Britain, and America could have an alliance, a strong naval alliance that would have made sense, much like they have today. But the problem is a lot of American elites were making their money off drug running. And back then, the big pharma of their day was opium, and opium came out of China. So China had just had the deposition of I think so, the Qing dynasty. I don't want to swear I have it right, but anyway, they were deposed, and they had the Republic of China under Sun Yat-sen that came forward. So as that happened, what happened was that a corrupt regime eventually came into power over the next 20 years called the Kuomintang, and although Britain wanted America to ally with Japan and have a sort of Western-friendly organization, America went to Britain and essentially said, we're not going to do this. Japan is the enemy. We need to be in China. And then, so they helped facilitate the rise of the corrupt regime in China. That was the Kuomintang, that eventually ended up being Chiang Kai-shek, that led to Taiwan after the loss of the Civil War after the occupation by the Japanese in the 40s and then into the 50s. They went there. And so we were at the heart of that sort of problem too, as well as Britain and other things, and go into the history of the Opium Wars, and that we could have allied with Japan and brought them in a westernization process. We didn't, which is why Japan allied with Germany, because they were scorned by the West, and Britain and America had opened it up, and Teddy Roosevelt had actually basically sanctioned the invasion of Korea. All right, all of that to go to a point to say that when Mao Zedong came in there, once again, communism was not a Chinese idea. It was an idea that came out of the West, and it came out of some of the German universities, but it was also the American opium trade that really enabled it. All right, so that's one place where we screwed up yet again, because we were chasing the money. And you're going to see a recurring theme that money does things that are deadly to the American people from its own financial leadership point, and that uses the state as a tool, as we'll see in the 1950s. Iran had originally been its sort of monarchy. Then the British got in there and they had an oil mandate. They decided to have democratic elections as part of the decolonization methods, and they elected a nationalist by the name of Mohammad Mossadegh. Okay, this guy was in there and he wanted to nationalize the oil companies. So what Britain encouraged America to do, and the CIA did, I think it was in '52. In any case, it was in the early '50s. Was we had a coup in Iran where we removed a democratically elected leader of the people whose goal was to try to encourage the wealth of that country, of Persia, a great empire, really, if you go back many, many years, and a secular empire at that, primarily, to go down a very different path. And so they enabled a military strongman in the Shah of Iran, who was infamous for using his secret police. And in fact, that's what led to the Islamic Revolution in Iran that eventually metastasized into the 1970s. And then you had the chemical warfare between Iraq and Iran, where we were basically the patron state of Iraq for that proxy war. And that every time, even though Iran was much larger than Iraq and had a much larger population, what would happen is Iraq would balance out the differences by the means of chemical warfare as well as conventional warfare to make sure that they were not successful. Which is why Iraq was, by the way, so surprised when we didn't allow them to invade Kuwait. But we got in there because we needed a war, and it was good for the military-industrial complex. And we did so because Saudi Arabia was more important to us than Iraq, because Saudi Arabia produced more oil, the links to the Bush family, you understand all that. All right, so all of this goes to say that in one case you had U.S. bankers fund the rise of a revolution. That was the Soviet Revolution, and the Russians still remember that because they suffered many, many years for that, as did all of Eastern Europe. You had China, where you had the foreign ideas imposed, and you had drug running, basically, was used to justify it. So when you see that Chinese fentanyl in the American streets, remember that we did similar things with opium if you go back far enough. And then in Iran, you have the situation where the CIA went in there and had a coup, and that's why you had the radicalization. And I'm not here to lionize any of these regimes. They're terrible regimes in their own right, but I just want to demonstrate to you so you have an understanding what it was that America did to get into all these places. So let's go ahead and stop. That's your deep history. You can go and dig down those holes if you want, but we're going to go now forward, and we're going to go to the end of the Soviet Union. Now, Soviet Union starts to fall in 1989, and they start falling before that. They get drawn into Afghanistan. It costs them too much money. That's the bottom line of it. So Gorbachev tries to open up the economy a little bit. Perestroika, as it's called, glasnost and opening. They go forward. At the same time, interestingly, China chose a different path. You remember Tiananmen Square, where people got run over by tanks. The Chinese military would stop their people, and the goddess of democracy flag was not worshipped there. But in Russia, the Russian military decided that they didn't want to fight this battle because they were too poor, and the commissars had taken everything in the black market was all that was left. So what happens is, over time, movements like Solidarity in Poland, outcomes of the Prague '68 revolution, Eastern Europe finally begins to chisel its way out, and what started as a trickle began as a flood. And November 9th, 1989, I think, you see the Berlin Wall come down, which was the wall from the division of Germany into the western and eastern sectors after the war, and the end of the beginning of the end of the Cold War. And very quickly, you see Poland, then Czechoslovakia, then to become Czechia and then Slovakia, Hungary, all these countries kind of tumble away. And eventually in 1991, the Gorbachev's unable to hold the Soviet Union together, and you see Yeltsin come to the fore. Where, who knew so much color revolution power was there? And that was the division of Soviet Union into its constituent republics. First, the Baltics went away, the Central Asian, the stands, but ultimately the last ones to separate were Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. And that's important to understand, because when we talk about Belarus and Ukraine, these are countries that you will be told on the media have been, that were swallowed up by the Soviet Union. This is not really true. Those were countries that had been part of Russia for, I think in the case of Ukraine specifically, I don't know Belarus, but it's going to be even longer there because they're closer to Moscow. They've been part of Russia for 350 years. So these are not places that are unfamiliar with Russia. They're hard of Orthodox civilization. Many people speak Russian. They live in Cyrillic. Anyway, and so now we are seeing the westernization, and this is what Ukraine's been working on. Part of why Russia's so mad is they're trying to change the language of the country and basically ban Russian, because they're trying to figure, rightly, I think, because this is sort of how France pulled itself together between different countries. If everyone's using the same language and it's different than what's across the border, they'll lose that empathy. And Russia sees these sort of actions. But in 1990, when all of this was falling apart, before Russia fell, but after Germany did, an agreement was made in 1990 to allow for the reintegration of Germany in exchange for NATO agreeing not to go east past the German borders. and this is the infamous thing you'll hear about. What was it? Jim Baker was the Secretary of State back then, and that deal was worked out. So Germany was reintegrated with the government in Bonn. Eventually, it was moved to Berlin, but that was Western Germany. The Federal Republic of Germany united that, and then there was supposed to be a neutralized Europe. But what happened was, as Russia fell into disarray, and their economy basically collapsed, and they were looking for help from the West. The West did the exact opposite. Plunder capitalism. The sort of thing. Take advantage of third world things, and those Western countries jumped into the opportunity to join NATO. If I remember right, in '97, I want to say. Actually, I'll bring it up because I want to say it right. NATO accession by years. We'll say who joins the NATO dates of accession. We'll do this accurately because it's only taking me a second to bring it in here. Give me 1 second here. We'll bring them all up so we take a look at this and have it all in one thing. Okay, so what happened in 1999 and remember, something important in the heart of this, Russia has asked as part of their demands that they want NATO to be reinstated to the 1997 borders. And when they say 1997, that will include the first three, but not the bottom ones. And this is kind of interesting. So the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland technically joined NATO on the 12th of March in 1999. So, and those were always in the German sphere of influence. That's just the way that was. But what's interesting is in 2004, there were 7 other countries admitted, and these are ones where Russia wants these countries demilitarized. Most importantly, of course, in Romania and Bulgaria, but also in the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. We also added Slovakia and Slovenia at that time, which in 2009, Albania and Croatia were added. That's not going to be a big deal. Although one of the things that's interesting there is that Croatia's president is saying right now, if NATO goes to war, they're not going to be part of it. Wonder what that's going to mean for their alliance. And then we added Montenegro and North Macedonia, which basically I think is just an effort to surround Serbia. Serbia is an Orthodox power that you really reigned Yugoslavia for a very long time, and the West destabilized the Balkans to take away that power from the center of their its own sad story. And another thing that probably triggers the Russians if you go back into it. So what happens is eventually Putin comes to power in Russia. I think in '99, if I remember right, it's when he's first in there. Yeltsin drinks himself into oblivion like a dancing bear in a dancing fool, and Putin begins reorganizing Russia. And slowly but surely, they get out of debt. They get their military going. And it's important. People look at Russia and say, "Oh, they have an economy smaller than Texas." Yeah, they have an economy smaller than Texas, but they don't have the fat and inflation like we do. So their military is very, very capable. They probably have better hypersonic missiles than we do, and they've had to basically rebuild and pull themselves out of the hole. And at the whole time, they've been sort of cascaded. And Russia, interestingly, if you go back, there was something called the NATO Partnership for Peace. And Russia had even inquired as late as 2005 if they would be invited to NATO. And the idea was that you would then end the need for wars in Europe. But that didn't happen. And why it didn't happen? Well, you can't really justify military spending in the United States, I suspect. And this is probably important during the Bush administration when you're saying that when there's no enemy and there's no threat there, and it gives no reason for American influence. And American influence, remember, the purpose of NATO, if you go back, the Germans said this originally. I think this was the truth of it. Or not the Germans, it was, maybe it was the French. I forget, no, it wasn't the French. Anyway, the saying of the diplomat at the time, I don't remember who it was who said it, but it's really true, is the purpose of NATO is to keep the Germans down, the Russians out, and the Americans in. Okay, and that's really what it does. America's influence in Western Europe, our sort of near periphery of our so-called empire, or if you look at the other way, the way that the bankers kind of use us and pull us in, there's a give and take in that Atlantic relationship, was designed to keep America in there. And the idea that Russia would be an equal counterweight and have as much of a say when it has its own interest into Central Asia was too much for anyone to bear. So what they did was it just kept cozying up to the bear and expanding eastward. And eventually Russia kind of had enough of it. So Russia was trying to protect their near periphery. There was basically a sort of dictator for life in Lukashenko. He has elections, and I think he has more popularity than he has in some time, to be honest with you. But Belarus was never a question. But Ukraine was. And what ended up happening was that in 2014, during when the Obama people were doing all those color revolutions, this is where Victoria Nuland comes into the picture, they end up having the Maidan coup, where the suggestion was made that the government was firing on the people in protest. We have people who are black clad on top of roofs. Who they were working for, no one will ever really know. But we do know happened was that there was a change of government. The pro-Russian government was deposed. A I should say, Western government was put in place, and that was around the time that you saw Russia began moving into Crimea to secure their interests, because Russia had their naval base there from time immemorial, and Russia needed access to a warm water port because the ports in the north freeze in the winter. So they moved in. They basically annexed Crimea. They had a referendum there, which was, to the best of appearances, fairly corrected. They grabbed a part of a country that didn't want to be part of a country, and this gets complicated because Crimea was Russian. It wasn't part of Ukraine. Khrushchev, who was the head of the Soviet Union, who was Ukrainian, but was in charge of all of the Soviet Union, because that's how that worked. Because it would be like if a Texan gave away territory that belonged to New York. That's how you have to think about it. But they gave Crimea to Ukraine, treating it as a gift, geographically sensibly, but also because of a personal animus by Khrushchev, especially in the post-Stalin years. But the problem was that the people there were Russian, whether it's Sevastopol, all those things, and the ports were there. So they wanted to be part of Russia, as did Donetsk and Luhansk. And if you look at a map of Ukraine at any point, what you'll see is, if you kind of draw a diagonal line across it, the south and east is pro-Russian, or at least Russian speaker, Slavophilic, and the north and west is more Western setup. And the country has an instability between these two, so partition is not an impossibility. Fast forward a couple more years, and what has happened is you see an effort. The Russians have decided, in the course of their own militarization, that they no longer want to be bookended by NATO. That they, after the various wars in the Middle East, after the various sanctions against their regime, they said to NATO, "We don't want you to expand anymore. You're going to go backwards, or something's going to happen." Their own terms, military technical solution. So they want basically Western influence out of Ukraine. I think they would settle for a Finlandization, which is to say you make it a neutral power. But in reality, if that doesn't happen, and the West sending weapons and convoys and troops and all these things with the governments in there, it doesn't make that likely. The Russians will probably have to contemplate an invasion. And at this point, they're so committed to this. Even if Western propaganda has advanced it, I think that that's what's going to happen. Because Putin can't afford to back down. He's not necessarily a popular at home. COVID has caused a lot of politicians to be unpopular in their own countries because of the austerity and because of this agenda that's been put in. So what are people doing? They're working for war. And one of the interesting things, that I heard yesterday, which I read something, Ice Age Farmer, I give credit to them for this, was the reason why China's buying up all that wheat is if there's a war in Ukraine, that's the breadbasket of Europe. And there's going to be a shortage next year, so you better be, doing what Joseph said in the Bible, filling up your stores high. So if Russia goes in there, the problem is for the West is they don't want to back down either. They don't want Russia expansion, and within the NATO position is that they don't think that there should be any limits on their expansion based on what countries want. But then again, they commit coups against legitimate governments all the time, as demonstrated by that historical background I've given you. And I haven't even talked about the Third World War. That's not even a problem to talk about. At the same time, the Russians don't want to have missiles right on their border, and they've gotten sick of having their near periphery be threatened. We are moving into a multipolar world. They feel like they have a military advantage at this point, that there's no economic loss, there's debt, and they see the vulnerability of America, specifically under a very weak president like Joe Biden, after the blunted, whatever that thing was in Afghanistan. I don't know if they were trying to fund Central Asian movements, and that's why they left those guns there. Who knows? Time will tell all the stories of that. But in any case, America is perceived to seem with their tail running, and now everyone's kind of looking for a war. And America gets stuck fighting wars because we have to defend our reserve currency. Our reserve currency in our economy, much of it, the dirty secret, is based on constant military spending, constant wars, and the infamous military industrial complex. So Russia's like, okay, let's throw into it. They're going to push back and say, you are not giving us any better options. And they're saying Ukraine is ours in our area, and it's going to not work against us. And there's a difference between saying we have to own it and it's not going to work against us. This whole thing may end up with a coup in Ukraine where there's a pro-Russian government, and that's actually probably the least bad solution that could happen at this time. However, what is happening right now is the exact opposite, that we are seeing Zelensky, who's the president down there, who has a lot of people who are manifestly unhappy with him in Ukraine, is getting weaponry like crazy from the West, from the UK and US specifically, from the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, as well as to some extent from the Poles. And that we're seeing a fracturing, interestingly, in NATO, because the Germans, who get a lot of their oil and who get a lot of their gas from Russia and who get resources, and the French, the Western Europeans don't really see the benefit of a war against Russia. They see a lot of loss. The UK and and the U.S. see this differently, and they're looking at the war as more positive. And the argument that's being had, as from what I understand within NATO, is the pro argument is, do you want Europe to be divided in two again, which the Europeans don't want. But on the other hand, the question that the Americans aren't asking is, do you want to have an alliance with Russia versus America, versus having the alliance with America? And when you look at America, when you look at the woke theologies, which a lot of the Europeans, even Macron, who's a Rothschild banker scion, was out there complaining about, they look at the weakness of the dollar, the weakness of the American military, the insanity of the sort of secular theology we're promoting, and they're saying maybe we need to do something different. And remember, Europe does a ton of trade with China. Actually, they do more trade with luxury goods to China than they do with the United States, and China's a rising and growing power. So a lot of people in Europe, and you look at places like France and Germany specifically, and the Germans, they remember the wars with Russia. They remember millions and millions of people dead, and they're not looking for a repeat of what they do every generation, it seems like. So could you see the breakup of NATO and the emergence of a new EU in opposition to the U.S. that's happening? Well, Croatia is a hint of the canary in the coal mine with that. But whether what the U.S. needs is to keep this alliance together, and what does it better than a little war? And so what they're doing is what they do best: proxy wars, thinking that they're going to draw Russia into a Vietnam type situation. So the theory is, you give a bunch of weapons to the Ukrainian government. The Ukrainian government goes into Donetsk and Luhansk, where there's basically self-declared separatist republics within Ukraine that are full of people who have now been admitted by the Duma as Russian citizens, even though they live in Ukraine. That's a tricky thing, right? And it's much like actually what happened with Germany and Danzig in a lot of ways. There were a lot of ethnic Germans, people who were born German on the wrong side of a line after a war, and one government goes in there to protect them. And in fact, the UN passed a law in 2005 that permits that as a legitimate rationale, not necessarily for war, but that those people deserve protection. And Russia may use that, much in the way that we use, I don't know, nuclear non-proliferation, pick what you want. We find whatever justification we need as a casus belli to go into the war. So what's happening now, it appears, is that the West, which is to say mainly the US and the UK and some of the Eastern European countries, are funding the Ukrainian government to activate it against the Ukrainian eastern regions that are being supported by Russia. And if that happens, that's because they want Russia to invade, because they're trying to play the PR version of this. At the same time, what's interesting is Russia is not just sitting on the Ukrainian border. After the mess in Kazakhstan, which they stomped out very quickly, which was designed to be a long-term problem, and there are still problems. Even this morning, we're reading about blackouts across Central Asia, and that's Russia's periphery, and this is designed, I believe, to be a distraction to them about what's happening. But we have seen the call-up of at least, I've been watching and listening, 400,000 troops and moving to the western borders, not only in Russia, but also in Belarus. And people are asking the question, rightly, if Russia is going into Ukraine, are they going to go into other parts of NATO as well? Will there be an invasion of Poland? Will there be an invasion of the Baltic republics? Sweden's putting artillery on the island Gotland in the middle of the Baltic Sea. So if Finland was something that was being threatened even, and how that's going to move, we may see a larger war, because I think Russia understands that if there is not a diplomatic solution, and I believe today the French, Germans, Ukrainians, and Russians are meeting to try to manage one, because Ukraine, I think there are people in Ukraine who understand this will not go well for them. If Russia has to invade, they probably will annex a big chunk of the country. They certainly will have to put in a puppet regime, and you may see a partition of the country in a more general war. However, remember, the West needs that war because the dollar's broken, and what makes the dollar have meaning is if the U.S. has the strongest currency. Keep another thing. China is also supporting Russia in this conflict, which gives Russia a certain amount of strength. But if Russia and the U.S. go to war, who wins? China. When Europe went to war with itself in World War II, who won? The U.S. The people who fund both sides and who have the military strength and the economic strength that emerges from this often win these wars. And when you look at this, we'll talk about India a little later in that sense. Or if a U.S.-Russia war happens, China wins. China's always had an interest in removing U.S. naval supremacy, but they've also had an interest in East Asia, and there were wars fought, in fact, during the communist regime, where there were actually between Stalin and Mao, where it actually happened. There were fights that happened along this border. There were skirmishes, and China's always been a little antsy along all of its borders. They've had fights with Vietnam, all these countries, and right now they're having fights with India, although Russia's trying to sort of skim those over. So the question you end up when you're looking at Ukraine is, if Russia For Russia to get what they want, which is to make sure the West is not there, how far are they willing to go? And if they're willing to go to war and they think that the West is going to constantly go forward, they may choose to go for a single strike to knock out NATO's command and control structures. The deployment of troops suggests at least that's a viable possibility. And no one's talking about this in the American media, but in the European media, they're talking about it. And what we are seeing is a decoupling potentially in the works of the EU center, which is to say, France, Germany, the Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg. I would think Italy, and then you have Eastern Europe as usual, trapped between, which being in that North German plain is not a good place to be. And you would suspect actually that being the case, I would not be surprised. And if the Russians are very shrewd politically, if they decided to invade and if they decided a war if NATO was inevitable, look for the Russian attack to fall on Latvia, Lithuania, probably Poland, because Poland and Russia just never like each other, and Britain, and that the Russians will potentially avoid attacking anything other than American bases in Germany, and otherwise, because I think Russia doesn't want a broader war. Russia would be happy to be part of a more integrated European superstructure where they can provide defense, although they perceive themselves as a separate Eurasian civilization. And when you look at the spheres of influence and you look at the line they're talking about, the 1999 line, what you see is Russia's basically arguing that if you draw a line at the Poland, Slovakia, Hungary border, that's Europe, and that they want to open up southeastern Europe to play, where they've had traditionally a lot of support, where Serbia is going to be friendly. And don't overlook that something could come out of Serbia, especially considering that in Bosnia, there's a separatist republic that was part of Serbia that was added to Bosnia, and we were playing in there too. That's a whole nother story. So that gives you that feel of it. But Russia has the ability, if a war comes, they have submarines that would be off the coast that the American if America has direct war with Russia, expect damages at home and expect them to be heavy. Russia will try to win quickly if they are. And now the question is if China is or isn't with them. So let's go. Let's talk about Russia for one more second. So they have submarine capacity and hypersonic missiles sufficient to probably be able to destroy a great deal of infrastructure. And given that we don't have a demonstrated hypersonic missile defense, unless we have something we're not talking about, it's an overwhelming air supremacy advantage, which renders neutral America's greatest weapons, which are like the aircraft carriers, and why we have them sitting there to be destroyed. You have to wonder if the people who are leading this country, especially when you look at the corruption between Burisma, between Hunter Biden, between Joe Biden and China, if China didn't put a patsy in there to get us into a war in Ukraine and get this country destroyed and get our naval strength just blown up. And I do think, to be honest with you, that I'm skeptical that the aircraft carrier will prove any more useful if a World War III breaks out than the battleships proved in World War II. They are not mobile enough against the high density attacks between drone warfare and hypersonic missiles. They're not going to be able to stop them. Not to mention these silent submarines. People don't know this. A Russian submarine just popped off the Atlantic coast the other day, and there've been talk about maybe putting missiles in Cuba and Venezuela to make America have strategic parity. This is the price of going into a multipolar world. People don't want America running the roost anymore, but if America doesn't run the roost, we're going to go into massive depression because our dollar won't have purchasing value. Now, why a strategy like this works is because China and Russia are no longer adversarial against one another, and Russia doesn't have to pivot. China now can move with a freer hand, and if we end up in war with Ukraine, what you might expect is China might make their run against Taiwan. So let's talk about what's happening out there in Eastern world. Japan has said that the U.S. will get their backing against Russia no matter what, and the reason for that is Japan can't afford to be not allied against China. Japan and China have a long and ugly history going back to Nanking, and way before that. They don't like each other. They're, whenever's one on the other side, it's like India and Pakistan, the other's going to be on the other. And Japan standing against China, you're seeing them start to remilitarize because they understand China, who's been doing more aggressive overflights of Taiwan, is ready to move on there if the opportunity exists. And that's why America has two carrier fleets sitting in the South China Sea in between. Now, I've wondered if they have them there so close to China where they're in the rocket envelope because they're worried about submarines sinking them. And the reason I say that is South China Sea is rather shallow compared to the rest of the Pacific east of Taiwan, and as well as deterrent, it does sort of negate certain advantages of that sort of attack if you don't think the rockets are such a problem, and if you're just trying to posture for the time being. Nonetheless, as we sit here and wait for the Olympics, a game of peace, which is kind of funny and ironic, what we see is China continues to upgrade their ability to have a larger navy, more effective force projection, and for the idea of a reconquest of Taiwan, that if it happens would potentially potentially engender a larger war involving the AUKUS alliance, which is Australia, the UK, and US, and Australia. And what makes this crazy is at the same time these countries in the West, I just have to insert this, are asking their people to go into to these wars in defense. We see they also have kicked many thousands of people out of their military for non-compliance with the COVID agenda. Some people say that's because they're afraid it's a bioweapon and these things are supposed to protect them from it, whatever the cost. I don't personally believe that, but that's an argument that's made. And then the Quad, which is a more informal alliance between India, Japan, the United States, and Australia, whose goal is essentially to contain China. And India is the interesting player in that. India does not get along well with China because they're grading on each other's borders, although historically they did have a better relationship, and India and Russia have a strong security relationship. And from what I've been reading is there have been ongoing efforts by the Russians to unite economically India and China and Russia in a more of a common development and framework in this idea that that they don't want to see a war between India and China. And it's sort of like the relationship between Soviet Union and Japan in World War II, if you want a metaphor. That they were countries whose allies were at war with one another, but between India and Russia, there's not a lot in it. And the idea is if India isn't fighting China, China probably can't be stopped by the U.S. moving into Taiwan. And so India, who wants a multipolar world, that's their goal, and they want to seat at the table. They came out of the non-aligned movement. If they can get along fine enough with Russia and China, they might choose to do so, trusting on their own strength. On the other hand, they might be looking at an axis where, you're looking at basically a sort of Eurasian empire that could stretch all the way from Paris to Beijing. And then what power will they have existing outside that? Do you choose to collaborate as sort of lesser partner? Do you try to get in at a bigger level, or do you offer opposition to that? Keeping in mind, China's historically had good relationships with many of the countries that surround India, who having, especially the Muslim countries, and especially Pakistan, that's something that makes it difficult, because once upon a time, U.S. supported Pakistan, so India supported Russia. Now the U.S. and Pakistan have terrible relationships. China went into Pakistan, gave them access to the sea. They're building a port there, Karachi. They also have a good relationship with Iran, which is less of a problem for India, but India is not feeling comfortable, and that's what's drawing them into the West, as well as the economics, because America's been looking for cheap goods, and they don't want from China anymore, so India was the next natural progression, as well as the large amount of Indian population that is in the UK, that is in the America as well, and they have these long historic links between these countries. So which way India will go is a big story. Japan is a known thing. Korea, will North Korea invade South Korea? I don't know. It's an interesting question. China wouldn't necessarily want the distraction, but it's very possible that South Korea may agree quietly to go into the Chinese sphere. And would China prefer a united Korea that existed that looked like South Korea in the Chinese sphere, or North Korea? It's an interesting question. And China, if they're successful at getting hegemony, may be able to force a reunification of Korea or accept the division, but bring that more into their sphere of influence, much like East Germany was, let's say, under the Russian sphere. Beyond that, the Philippines kind of have played back and forth. Right now, they're more friendly to the West, but that's where that's at. Australia is totally on board with the West, but on the other hand, because China would be interested in the uranium down there as a resource colony, and in having control of the whole Southeast Pacific from that point, they are undermanned, but their government is literally destroying their people. And this is one of the things you have to ask when you ask this question, and you have to ask about the depths of the strategy which is being used here, is why are the Western governments destroying the interests of their people at the same time they're seeking a war? This is like a controlled demolition of these states. It's true in the U.S., Canada, Australia, up until relatively recently, the U.K. and New Zealand. They're insane down there. I don't know what's their issue, but okay. So we talked about them. And China, if they go to war with Taiwan, unless the military experts who look at this have come to the conclusion, unless there's a pre-implanted military that's designed to divert an invasion, which America has not yet done, and no one else has offered to do, that Taiwan will fall. Now, Taiwan could do a lot of damage to China. Taiwan has threatened that they'll use their own missiles to blow up the Three Gorges Dam. You're looking at an 8-figure death toll. But ultimately, you're still going to have to live with that, and that's the problem for the Taiwanese government. If they're fighting a war against China they can't win, and they do so much damage to China, what's going to happen to the people in charge? And that's a question they have to figure out, and they have to trust how much effort they have in their their allies. They trust Japan, I think. They probably think Australia has an interest, and people look at America and think, what the hell is wrong with this country? Which is why it makes it even more insane that America is looking at a war with Russia, and why the bear poked us. Because the bear thinks, and the bear thinks rightly, it can get away with it, just like that German admiral who was forced to resign in India said. Iran, now we'll bring back into the story. Iran has been trying very hard to get itself into this axis, and with some success, it provides access for China to the Middle East as a pathway. It's a big market. It's a chance to reach out and be able to influence the Saudis away from the American sphere of influence, to build a land line to get around the U.S. Navy dominance that has existed historically, although it is fading quickly, along the new Silk Road, and to potentially remove, if you can sort of reformat how OPEC works, it's another indirect attack on the dollar and the idea of the purchasing value of that. And it's pushing America out of the Middle East and pushing America out of its influence on Europe and just the peripheries of Britain and Japan, which is what historically we've sort of had, and we've gone much deeper, not to necessarily possess, but more to disrupt. Because remember, war is what makes the U.S. money. They're not looking for stability, they're looking for predictable instability. And that's kind of crazy, but that's what happens, and the Iranians know that better than most, as we have been involved there. So they're expanding their influence. They're in wars in Yemen, they're involved with the Syrians, and now they have a relationship with the Russians that is developing very nicely, I would say, for them. And it gives them the opportunity to maybe achieve their strategic goal, which is the removal of the state of Israel. And of course, Israel's leaning into the U.S., saying, we need to get into this war now, we need to do that. And Israel's been, committing strikes with impunity against Syria, against Iran, against Iraq for many years. Things that other countries would commit wars against, they're allowed to get away with because of their control of the media and their patrons in the West. And so that has been another thing where, you could say they're on our side, or you could say we're saddled with them. Of course, they've been double dealing with the Chinese and the Russians too. And the question is, if Iran and Israel go to war, or other powers could be brought in. The American Congress would love to fight the Israeli wars to the very last man, but whether or not they can even afford to do that is an interesting question. But if look what happens if the Russians and Ukrainians go at it, and America gets drawn in, every other flashpoint that we've been holding down goes away. Because this was the Pax Americana. This was the idea that America was strong enough where no one went to war and everyone was more concerned with making money. But now everyone sees, just like in the time of COVID, where everyone's looking to get whatever advantage they can, countries are no different, and they're looking to grab up pieces and to draw out the lines where a multipolar world will form. And I will tell you some of the poles of that world. Probably there will be North America, there will be Western and Central Europe, there will be a Russian sphere, Turkey may or may not have a sphere, China will have a sphere of influence, India will have a sphere of influence, Iran will have a sphere of influence, and the Arab world will have a sphere of influence. And then whatever happens in Africa, the reason why the French are in there in West Africa isn't just for population replacement. They want oil, and as you see coups all over the place, you see fighting between Russian and French mercenaries in Mali, you see Burkina Faso just had a coup the other day down there in West Africa. These things are playing out in real time, and that's why you see Europe getting involved in its near periphery as much as anything else, because they're thinking that's what's going to be needed for their survival when they're going to be boxed out in the Middle East. And this is part of the great game, how this is all playing out. We also see, not just mentioned, there'll be a Latin American bloc. Whether Mexico will be part of North America with Los Gringos in the end, or if they'll be part of that, is still in play. I tend to think they'll still be part of North America for a lot of different reasons, but we'll see how that all plays out. And you recognize that this looks a lot like the old North American Union, New World Order 10 version 10, I think, should say, super regions on which government will operate. But in order to have that, people have to have war, they have to have misery, they have to have suffering. We've had COVID, we're having famine come forward out of this. War is naturally on the table, and it allows governments who otherwise would have to be accountable to the people. And that's one of the stories we need to tell at this too. Why America does this is not just because of the external influence, the prestige in the US dollar, but because of the fact that they know the people hate them. Biden's approval ratings in the 30s, Congress's approval ratings at the 10s, and then we're watching literally now it's over 50,000 trucks, including American trucks, descending on Ottawa. Why that should be the place, who knows? History has a lot of weird quirks, but we are seeing the effort draw out where people don't want things happening the way they are, and that you're seeing the economies of the United States has basically ground to a halt, that we don't have the ability to trade money like we used to, so inflation's going up where people can't buy extra goods. That's exacerbating the problem we have of a slowdown, of a lack of jobs. We have death that's happening because of people who are having different medical issues. We don't want to go into what those are today, but you know what that is, and that's a worldwide problem. Remember, that emerged from China. Yeah, the U.S. funded it, the same bankers who funded the rise of communism everywhere else, because they wanted a single global order. And whether they did it in American guise or European aristocrats or Chinese technocrats, at the back of this story is this idea that the world is being maneuvered into a single system of totalitarian technocracy, a secular theocracy, and where you're going to have a constant surveillance state on top of you, because that gets rid of a lot of people and it allows the elites to remain in control. And one of the stories at the back of this World War III is that the elites have more in common with each other than they do with the different people they serve. So if pretend the kings all want to get rid of the peasants, what better way than to send them off on a jolly little war? And I think that's part of the story here. They would much rather have us be productive, but if we're not going to be productive, they're willing to be subtractive. And that is the background to what we are seeing in World War III. Other things to keep an eye on: Turkey, kind of a double dealing country, have good relationships with the Russians, have good relationships with different areas, but no one trusts them. They're trying to build a new Turkic empire, and they want to have a new Ottoman future. They've been talking a little bit. Iran has cut off the supplies to Turkey, so it seems like Turkey's more on the Western camp, but they're someone who will double deal. They've done it before. They'll do it again. And beyond that, if you're here, if you're listening in the English language here, you're probably in the Anglosphere. We have each other, and we have the insane people in charge. So we are going to have to figure something, between good old Airstrip 1 and the colonies here. I don't know. It's what they call Britain and Orwell. We are in a bad spot. We are morally compromised. We have weakened militaries. We have cultural discontinuity. We have ineffectual government. We have less financial support. We are probably at a military disadvantage, and we are overextended. It's a bad spot to be in. And if you're like me, you're a Christian, and you look at our culture from the perspective of what was morally correct, we promote some of the worst degeneracy around the world. And you wouldn't expect divine favor to come to that, which is one of the reasons why Pinelanders are people who are in the West who are saying, look, we need to get away from our governments and form something new, or some things new. It's sort of a placeholder a little bit. There'll be more than one nation, I think, if it came to that. We talk about the idea of separation and in a post-American mind space, where people say, oh, we just need to go back to the way it was. And trust me, I write books on this. The way it wasn't good either. This has been a long managed decline by people who want to see a different future. So that is the world at a glance. And what we should expect to happen here is very hard to predict. But at the moment, with all the weapons that are being sent into eastern Ukraine, if the government of Ukraine goes in and accelerates its attacks on its own militants, Russia will be pushed into Ukraine. If Russia's pushed into Ukraine, they may conclude a general war is inevitable, and all these dominoes will fall very quickly, including Russia's strategic doctrine, which allows for them to have a first attack effort, and they may try to attack NATO directly. Maybe not in every country, though. They may choose to limit that attack and see how this evolves in alignment with whatever their strategic objectives are. I don't think Russia is necessarily looking to add territory, but if a general war is fought and it ends up being a world war, look for Russia to try to go ahead to at least Poland again. And they may not include Poland, because I think especially if a deal is made where the Europeans leave the Americans to fight this war, the line will be that the EU border will be it, except that the Baltics may or may not be sacrificed. They may leave them in. The history of the Baltics is interesting. They once upon a time part of, the Teutonic Order went up in there, the Livonian Order. So there are people who are more Scandinavian than they are Russian. And I think for a free hand for the integration of Ukraine, or at least that part of Ukraine which Russia really wants, which is not the Northwest. In fact, they would probably be happier with an alliance where maybe there was a separated rump state there, I think. Because if Russia goes west of the Dnieper River, they're dealing with partisans who are going to be much more hostile than the Slavophilic population. And ultimately, for Russia's purposes, they don't really need to get closer to Central Europe. They have control over that and influence through their petrochemical policy. But they would love to be able to get to maybe Moldova's border, be able to reach to Romania, Bulgaria. And remember, the old goal of Russia has always been the reconquest of Constantinople. They see themselves as an Orthodox civilization, and you may see in the future there will be more fights in that area between the Turks and the Russians again, which has been a long war. You go back to the Crimean War, and we're talking about battles and civilizations that have been fighting over these borders for hundreds and hundreds of years, and we assume they've all gone away, and maybe they haven't. Things don't change that much, and so Russia getting closer to that and influencing those civilizations in Romania and Bulgaria. I mean, those places jumped into the West at the time of strength, but when NATO is gone, look for Russia, Bulgaria, and Greece to have a lot more influence and maybe make peace with Russia and have an Orthodox civilization so that the line will be from Poland to Austria will be Western Europe. And everything east of there will be separate, and you probably see Scandinavia integrate a little bit more into West, and the EU will have some more meaning then, which is what the French and Germans want anyway. And that if they get any more imperial adventures, it'll be in West Africa, maybe from points Tunisia east, and then if the Turks can get their influence, they'll be fighting the Arabs and the Iranians for who's going to control the Middle East. This was the great game. And so what does that mean for America? Well, you see America and Canada are largely, the peoples of North America are largely integrated. So you would expect them to work together. England has made a decision where they're not going the path of Europe, and that's fine. They will have to go the path of North America then. We'll see if Ireland does the same. It would be interesting and sort of logical to me that they would, but they may not choose to. Or you may see England get separated from Scotland. You may see the thing parsed out and that be integrated into Europe because of the geography in the long term. Australia's in a really hard spot geographically. If China gets big, Australia is going to have to make terms with them if America can't stop them, and America can't stop them because it can't handle itself. And then Latin America, the other thing is they may be a quiet ally where you might see, how should I say, paramilitary type operations brought in by drug gangs, cartels, in association with tribes in the United States because they want to remove American influence so that they can develop their own thing. And what does that mean for America? It means we look a lot like maybe in the worst case scenario, like the Balkans in the 90s. But we don't have solid leadership if a war is committed against us. And that war doesn't have to necessarily involve a direct attack. You know, the FBI went out yesterday and they put out a warning about extremists taking down the grid. I'm like, they're pre-launching all the propaganda to blame everything on their own people. So if the Chinese took out the grid, it'll be white supremacists. If the Russians take out the grid, it'll be white supremacists. If Antifa took out the grid, it'll be white supremacists. If the Congress took out the grid, it'll be white supremacists. And this boogeyman attack that is holding the cities in thrall, these city-states where the bankers are, is just destroying the ability of the country to connect. And it's forcing America inevitably closer and closer to the Civil War I talked about, where people in the country who are not allowed to live according to the way they want are going to be forced to arm up and offer resistance against this. And because of the domestic politics, and it's become so unpopular that the left is in danger of leaving because the number of people getting sick from the shots, as well as their unhappiness about the larger economy, the government's going to have to change the information, because what they can't afford is an organized and united America that's going to exist and push back against some of this. They don't want that. It will not be permitted to happen. And they would rather destroy America. And the elites can go escape to another country. They can sit in Switzerland and watch while New York burns. And it's sad. I mean, but on the other hand, the people in these cities and have gone on board with this agenda for a very long time. And the destabilization efforts that have been conducted by, you look at the KGB long-term infiltration, the Bezhmov videos, and the Chinese Confucian Institutes, they are very effective at this sort of asymmetrical warfare, and we do it too. That's what USAID is about, but we're not used to being the victims of it. And that our whole media apparatus, and including a lot of our government, which is probably bought and paid for in both parties. Because you look at these wars we're getting into, the military-industrial complex, the bankers leading into it, one last big cash grab. This will be the one that's going to be the bite that we choke on. So what is the sane policy here? The same policy is to let the Wookiee win. Russia has legitimate reason to have influence in Ukraine. America needs to find a way to allow that, and for the interests of NATO, say, look, we are going to defend our borders, but these are not within our borders. Do what you have to do. And ideally say, like, do you really, if there were shrewd leadership in Washington, they would say to Russia, do you really want to be that close to China? You got a lot of land and not a lot of people. And you're not going to break that relationship because they've built trust, but at least you can start them asking the question and say, we'll pull back. We don't want war. And honestly, it's not a terrible thing to agree to pull back out of those countries if you demilitarize this. Because, frankly, if you're the U.S. and you're worried about who's going to be the existential threat, yeah, the Russians can win a military invasion, but they don't have the geopolitical input, other than the fact they're pissed off about how awful the ideas we have are. And that's the moral aspect of it. Remember, if you're an Orthodox Christian, we're a Christian channel. We look at what America does, and we literally sit here and think, oh, God, if he follows his own word, is going to bring hellfire down on this country. And that may very well happen. And whether he chooses to do that with indirectly or directly, the Lord works in mysterious ways. And I think a lot of people who are in the right wing realize that. We realize the failure of the right was we chased money, we chased materiality, we chased wealth and militarism, and we didn't actually stand up for our moral obligations, and we were individualists who we may have lived well personally or within our families, but we let our society go to hell because we surrendered the culture war. And that's because propaganda and the price was too high. Now we live under cancel culture and a technological apparatus that's been constructed where people can't speak against this. And that's just true in other countries. And you see how that's being employed where the Germans want to shut down Telegram, where the protests, in some places even riots against these impositions on these by these governments on their people who don't want to be genetically modified. You see they're pushing forward and they don't care. And in the countries you see them doing that most aggressively, those are the ones who are going to say, you know what, this American model's dumb. I want to work with the Chinese. And even if the Americans are trying to do the same thing, which Biden is, we can't do it because we're not built that way. It's not in our DNA. We're not constructed that way. And so we will be jettisoned as an obsolete model. And that's the global perspective on why this war is happening now. That America is trying to have one last fight in service of the same globalists who are basically setting us up to put our own head in the noose. And that's why if you are saying you should be against this war and if you want to prevent the loss of a lot of death, the only positive I can say if this war comes is that it will not unite America. But if the people who we are fighting have as good an understanding of American politics as I believe they do, they will understand that the people who are pushing this are the ones who could be targeted. And then we will have a new future where we will have basically the resettling of a continent that will have a lot less cities, a lot less military bases. And let's just hope we aren't dealing with hostile occupation. I suspect on the West Coast that's more of a fear than the East Coast. China's been needing agricultural, help for a long time. California produces 40% of America's food. Wouldn't be surprised if you saw Los Angeles and San Francisco spared if there was a larger war so that the Chinese could occupy them, or if you see some sort of biological warfare designed to remove people who don't fit the sort of genetic, profile they want. I know these are very ugly, very difficult to contemplate questions, but I'm sharing this with you so that you have an understanding of what's potentially at stake, because the media is completely absent from this debate. They're completely absent from telling you that we are pushing into this and that we are sleepwalking into a tragedy. In terms of survival, if you are in a major city, especially if you are in New York City, or if you are in very close proximity to either a military base or a missile silo, wouldn't say it's the worst idea to have at least a plan to get somewhere else quickly. And if you have the means and wherewithal to get somewhere no one cares about, where there's nothing of particular value, and there's nothing that the military has there because it's not of particular value, that's a good idea. That's why I'm in northern New England. It's an area that we think is relatively safe from those sort of things, because we don't have anything we want. We just got trees, and no one needs more trees. The age of sail is over. I don't know what to tell you beyond that, other than say that if you're worried about nuclear war, basic protections is understand that if fallout happens, don't look at the blast, or don't look at the blast when the thing goes off. You'll burn your retinas. Make sure that any air you have coming in is not coming directly at you. Lead shields are best. If you have money and you want to blow it, go to a dentistry store, get one of those things you used to use when you do the X-ray for the cleaning. But otherwise, you can use metal slats at angles to make sure things aren't coming in. Make sure you have at least a 2-week supply of water. If you have potassium iodide, that's a major plus. Cheap to get on Amazon still. You'll be glad you have it. It lasts for at least 2 years. What it does is it protects your thyroid gland from uptake of radioactive elements. I think it's cesium, but I don't want to swear by that. In any case, it will protect your brain from being fried. If you don't have that, hey, you have a mattress, you go to the lowest round, and you realize where the fallout's coming from. Usually, if you can survive the beginning of it, you'll survive the worst of it. And hopefully it doesn't come to that. I don't necessarily think it will. I'm just giving you prudent warnings. Do expect power grid disruptions. The government's basically hinting that that's going to come either way, whether they provoke that, whether it's a legitimate response from the people. whether it's done by militants, who knows at this point. You can't trust anything you see. All you can do is understand the motives of the actors involved and understand there are no good actors. There's no good actors outside America. There's definitely no good actors inside America. And that the bipartisan coalition funded by the military-industrial complex and big pharma's rushing to go to war for one last fight, don't give it to them. We don't need to help them. And if you are in the military, and I realize this, or if you are in logistics, the time is to remove yourself from the participation. Otherwise, you're walking yourself into a trap. And I don't know what else I can say to people. So that is the background of it. If there are any questions, real fast here, I'm happy to answer them. What do I give as the percentage of probability of Russia to invade? That's a great question. Russia is committed to seeing Ukraine in the Western sphere. If a deal is not struck for Russian influence to be realized there within the next week or two, I expect the odds of an invasion are greater than 50%. Whether that will be a permanent occupation, a coup to replace the government, a partition, I can't say. But I think that the most logical options kind of filter down to two. There's three options. Option one is they annex the whole thing, which I think is less likely unless a wider war of NATO happens. Option two is they annex the south and east. They've wanted the port of Odessa for a long time. That's in southwest Ukraine. You would expect then that they'll annex the southern part of Ukraine in whole, and then the Dnieper River from, what's it called? Dnipropetrovsk. Bad at these names, and Kharkiv and those areas, and leave Kiev and a rump of West state that will probably at that point have a Russian-friendly regime, and then they'll directly annex those other territories so that they deny access of NATO to the Black Sea, increasingly, other than through, I guess the closest port would be Varna over there in Romania and Bulgaria. I think that's where they have their forces. And you can't put that much in there because you got to go through the Straits and Turkey. The stronger Russia gets, the less Turkey's going to want to fight. So I think the odds of Russia's invasion, if a diplomatic solution are not reached, are greater than 50%. I don't see the downside for them. They have pushed into this place. They can't back down any more than we can. So everyone has to walk away with a win. And this is the game theory of it for those who are curious. The logical, peaceful solution would be a partition of Ukraine where the West was allowed to be into the larger European superstructure. The Southeast would be either integrated into Russia or a separate Russia client state, much like Belarus, maybe as a union state that's somewhat separate and somewhat not, that I think the Ukrainians would like better, that the Europeans would have to manage it, but the Americans would basically be kicked out of influence in Europe for that point, because that would say that a new alliance had been reached between France, Germany, and Russia, and basically Eastern Europe would kind of be left on the lurch of having to be responsible to Berlin, and the EU technocrats want that. But then America, at that point, America would never go for that because it would be the destruction of NATO. It would ruin the solidarity of the alliance, and it would show America as having no ability to make a difference in its periphery. It still wouldn't be a terrible idea, except for the fact that weakness leads to wars, and wars mean if we lose a war, we lose the dollar. If we lose the dollar, we lose the world, and we end up broke. And we can't trade. The American economy, if I remember, has 25% of it's caught up in finance. And it's even worse now. The reason the market's going down like crazy because none of the productivity is working. And that you see the only reason it's surviving as long as it is because the government is allowing hedge funds like BlackRock to buy everything up, where we're literally getting to a point where we may be a private monopoly in the future if we allow the legitimacy of who owns those goods and who owns those corporations. And of course, corporations can offshore like it's not a thing, so hedge funds don't care. But what we're seeing is the removal of capital from the U.S.-based system to this privately held system. Now, admittedly, it's in alliance with the Federal Reserve Bank and the U.S. Treasury, but those things can change very simply, and the interoperability of the Rothschild banking system is something that, plays at the heart of this. So I do think the odds of the Russians going in the next 30 days are very high. I'd say it's over 50%, and if you held a gun to my head and said if Russia just goes in there and all they end up with is a basic war, I think Russia annexes the south and east of the country, and I think that then a rump state that is friendly to Russia is put on the western border, and maybe that's the best deal. And look, nobody's happy with that outcome, but I'd rather have unhappy peace than a happy war. That being said, the Americans, policymakers in the West aren't used to thinking that way, and they think they're going to arm the guerrillas, which there will be, by the way. There'll be partisans. I mean, this is a tragedy for the Ukrainians, any way you slice it. Um, they will probably push into that, and Russia may decide to destroy a bunch of NATO bases as a response. And at that point, I don't think they can back down. Then you're in a general war, even though nobody wants it. And the question is which countries jump and which countries stay. If Russia is canny, it's like when World War II started, they had something called the Sitzkrieg. Germany went into Poland, and as well as the Soviet Union. People forget about that fact, and they partitioned the country. And then there were at least 9 to 11 separate efforts by the Germans to make peace with the West about the war. The Russians may try to do the same thing with France and Germany, and if you couple that with a shared Russian or Russian Chinese attack that takes out the American aircraft carriers, their main force projection. Look, the Germans would love to not have to listen to the American troops that are sitting there. They would love to be free of that. And if Russia can enable that, the French have always kind of wanted to go their own way too. Think of de Gaulle. So I think that those countries would take the deal. And I think, frankly, they'd be smart to take the deal because the age of Atlantic containment of communism doesn't make sense when the communists are sitting in Washington, D.C. And that the insanity of our own ideologies destroys the ability of the constancy to pull this alliance together. So what it does mean, though, is that the demonstration of force will come heavily on those countries which are seen to be inevitably in the U.S. sphere. That's going to be, Poland again, maybe the Baltics, depending what they want to do, in the U.K., I would think, in Europe, as well as any attacks in America. Turkey's a more complicated story. I don't know. Russian-Turkish relations. Russia may try to go to Incirlik. They may try to take out Suda Bay. That's the U.S. Navy base. It's there, apparently. We've been putting a whole bunch of troops in there, as well as in Alexandropolis. These are different places. Greece may get hit pretty heavily in the military bases. But the Greeks are friendly to Russians because they're Orthodox, and I think, they would also be happy with peace. And who does America have on our side? Well, it's just the English. Because remember, NATO is America and our vassals, all right? And so those countries that want to be free of it, who don't want to be part of that, who basically are the non-British countries, they're going to look at this differently. And so this may be a war where the lines are drawn differently, where America can either... Russia knows all this, and they know the geopolitics of it, and they know if they can strike America and show America to be done, let's say have submarines sunk 5 carrier fleets at once, how is America going to force project if these European countries don't host them? And how are you going to stop Taiwan? How are you going to stop any of these things? You can't, and that's the end of the American dollar. And then we're going to be fighting each other because we won't be able to buy anything. All of our purchasing power won't mean crap because no one will take our money anymore. And that's why our elites, sometimes people who would seem otherwise insane, because they made a very bad deal very long ago and they're stuck defending it, get caught up in wars that don't make a lot of sense. And this isn't the sort of thing they teach here. They talk, war is simplified to stupidity, where we're talking about democracies and ideologies, but it's about resources, it's about relationships, and we've been very bad in our relationship management. We've been very hubristic, and so what America has to do is take the blows, accept it's going to be a bad time, and retreat. But will we do that? I don't know, and that's the question. But I think the Russians are willing to push the envelope. I think if push comes to shove, the Chinese will help them. And I think the allies we have are not very reliable beyond the Anglosphere. And that being the case, I think giving the Wookiee what he wants and buying time would be smart, but that would require long-term planning and leadership that makes sense. If that exists in the United States, it doesn't exist in the United States government, and whomever would be implementing it would not be doing so in the interest of the American, Canadian, British, Australian, or New Zealand people. Who knows New Zealanders? That might be where the sellouts get to hide as their own little sanctuary protected by China, the official Shire. I don't know. It's a dangerous time, and hopefully this review has helped you have better understanding. Let me see if there's any other questions. If there are, good to see you, Greg, Patches, Miguel. Thank you for your question, John. If you like the show, support the show, Venmo, CVC, PRV. I'll give you the deep analysis, and I'm going to be watching this, and I'll give you a real politic assessment of it as someone who's in the post-American dissident right. That's where I am. I can't support this country anymore, but there are good people who are trying to survive, and I ask that as the world goes forward, remember North America, if as long as the world keeps spinning, and the Lord, that's in his hands, only the Father knows the time that ends, but if it keeps spinning, there are people here who want to rebuild and remember, and who want to go back to being a humbler nation in the city on the hill, and and that's going to mean a lot more countries in North America, I think, in the future. I think the days of the old American empire and these are the last days of empire. So Heavenly Father, I just pray that in these times of trouble, that people use this opportunity of this chaos to find their way to you, to understand that all kingdoms of man fall, all these efforts are doomed to fail, save only that the heavenly kingdom awaits those of us who accept the Lord Jesus Christ as our Savior, and offer our sincere repentance for the many sins we have committed, and understanding that if judgment comes as retribution for the things that we've earned, that to remember and ask the Lord that even as we may have to weep, that you don't forget your people, that there were many good people who did much work for you for many years, and not that we deserve anything, but we know you are faithful to those who adhere to you, Lord, and just ask that you lead us to a place of safety so that your will be done. And in Jesus' mighty name, I just pray that for everyone who listens to this channel, whatever country you're in. We are on the verge of something that could just be devastating in an incredibly short amount of time, depending upon the tactics that are employed. You know, people may choose gradual roll-ups, or the Russians may go all in at once, and the Chinese may be with them. And I will say, if they decide they're going to win this war in a single strike, all we can do is destroy them, maybe, but we will not survive that as in the world we know it, and you got to be ready for that. EMPs, maybe biological weapons, maybe asymmetrical warfare, definitely. Expect to see that either way. Cyber strikes, more destabilization of the U.S., and at the same time, you know what? Hopefully, there'll be a little bit of time, and maybe we can. The only thing you could do to stop this is if a new government came to power, that was in the West and that was sane and said, okay, let's sit at the table and really make the peace. And it will be a multipolar world where the dollar will be gone and America will have to rebuild. And that it may not be one country anymore, but that would require the people who've done all the bad things and who have suffered none of the consequences to be wise and shrewd, or the people who have the ability to get around the security state and technological surveillance around them. And I don't think we have that capacity right now. Maybe if they turned on the people who were their corrupt masters, but the people who said they were defending the law at all cost were basically the people holding us all together in a prison camp, where now we're going to suffer the consequences. And that's the sad truth of it. So let's hope the Lord will lead us out of this. I don't pray for the salvation of America. I pray for the salvation of the good people of America and of the West and of the Christians. And I pray also for our Christian brothers in the East. I pray for the Russians, for the Orthodoxy, because I don't, they're Christians too. And if we were sane people and we were still a righteous Christian civilization, we would understand China is the larger threat. But the people in charge of us are not good people anymore. And I think a lot of people who are dissidents understand that what must happen, and we're just trying to survive and speak truth and put a record down for history to remember. That's all we can do now. So, kind of a somber chat, but it was something that was needed, and hopefully you found value on it. Thank you once again for your support of this program. Join the Telegram group t.me/Atlantic Homeland, Venmo CVC PRV. I come on most mornings to share some thoughts with you, cover news periodically, and this channel covers not just news, but we do deep dives. We give you historical context. I'm your big brain here to be picked at, and we always encourage people in the chat to interact. Share the program. Please like, please subscribe. We're going to try to build this up, bring some new voices in, and we'll just watch, and otherwise prepare as best you can. Things only get crazier from here. What are we looking for in the next couple days? If the Russians make a deal with the French and Germans, that would be a very positive sign for all of our survival. Our government will come even more unhinged if that's the case, but maybe if they're unhinged enough, they'll finally be removed. And then we need to sit down and figure out something different. Keep an eye on Ottawa this Saturday, all those trucks being there. Something may happen there that will change the future of North America. And I say that because there's a lot of Americans heading up there too. What was possible with there was on January 6th, there was a waiting moment where people were looking for leadership to emerge that didn't, because they trusted someone who was on board with the sort of the bankster globalist regime, or at least was too afraid to make a difference at any point. This is something that's popular driven with no leadership other than the demand that they want the old world gone, or they want the new world gone of mandates and masks, and they want a new start. And the governments may not give in, but that doesn't mean the people have to go home. And the thing about it is, they don't provide anything. They only take, use, and redistribute. So if the people are willing to hold out long enough, then these governments can be removed. But the problem is, while we're removing the people who were doing the damage to us, these other powers may end up removing all of us, seeing the opportunity. And that's the damned curse of it, that we are stuck in the bad. We are stuck fighting on the side that's the bad guy in the war. And whether or not we support them or not, even if we actively resist them, we still have to deal with the reality that these people have control. As Joe Biden once infamously said, well, how are you going to fight people with F-16 and tanks? And the answer is, what you make sure is that nothing moves. This is what's needed. We need the great stillness to stop this. And what's happening in Canada might offer the last chance for the West to reclaim itself. And it's a strange thing it should come down to that, but in America, it's not happening right now. It can't. People are too scared. The police state's too strong. But if it happens there, it may spread, and that's what we need. Fire only needs a single spark, and you know what? The cold winter can dry out some wood for some kindling. So let's keep an eye on what happens over there, and hope the Russians give us a little more time, and maybe the Lord gives us a chance for repentance and a chance to. You can't save this, but there are ways that can break up that are a lot less painful. And if that doesn't happen, I just wish you luck of survival. And just say, even if you can't save your life, save your soul, give it to Jesus. And that's the best advice I can give to anyone right now, because, tomorrow is not promised. Today's your day of salvation. Proclaim the Lord, and try to get your citizenship in heaven. It's a gift, and it's it's the only free gift you're ever going to get that's worth anything. So just trust me on that one and take that one forward. So God bless each and every one of you. Thank you for listening to the broadcast this morning. I am Tom Kaczynski.